There is a very famous mystery called the DY at LOV Pass incident that occurred in the 50s in Russia, where you had 9 highly experienced hikers go out on an expedition and then not turn up at their rendezvous point. When a huge search party is launched and they're discovered, the circumstances under which they are found are truly baffling. I mean, you had people with clothes, some without. You had people that were mildly radioactive. You had people that were missing body parts, and none of it really fit the narrative that there had been an avalanche or that they had died of hypothermia. It was almost like something had attacked them, but we have no idea what it was. And so, that mystery has endured for years, for decades. And so, today's story is referred to as the American DUI at LOV Pass incident because you have a group of people that go missing inexplicably and then are located under baffling conditions. And just like the original DUI at LOV Pass, we know in today's story what happened to them, for the most part. We just don't know why. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel, because that's all I do here. And I upload 3 to 4 times a week, if not more. And so, if that's something you're interested in, I would encourage you to gently karate chop the like button and then subscribe to this channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly upload. Alright, let's get into today's story. Today's story takes place in 1978 and it focuses on 5 young men that were best friends, basically inseparable, who all lived in Yuba City, California, and they came to be known as the Yuba City 5. These 5 young men were all either mildly intellectually disabled or had a mental health disability, but they were all very high functioning. Jack Hoot was the youngest of the group. He was 24 years old. He was fairly uncomfortable in social situations and didn't do well around strangers, but around his 4 best friends. He blossomed and was incredibly funny and lighthearted and got along extremely well. Ted Weiher was the oldest of the group. He was 13, and he kind of took a big brother approach to Jack Hoot. He kind of looked after Jack specifically. Those two were very, very close. And Ted was known to actually occasionally make phone calls on Jack's behalf when Jack felt uncomfortable calling a stranger on the phone. You know, Ted would step in and be the bigger brother and make those phone calls for him. Bill Sterling was 29 years old and he was deeply religious. He would spend a lot of his time going to the library where he would read Christian literature. Jack Madruga was 30 years old and he was an Army veteran. However, he had been discharged from the Army after a medical evaluation determined that his IQ was too low. So he was discharged from the Army. He was the designated driver of the Yuba City 5 because he was the only one of the 5 that had a driver's license. Jack loved being the driver because he loved his white and turquoise Montego, a 1916 Montego. It was like his prized possession, and he felt very proud driving the group around. Last but not least, you have Gary Mathias, who was the unofficial ringleader of the group. He was 25 years old. He also was an Army veteran, and he, as well, had been discharged following a medical evaluation where they diagnosed him with schizophrenia. So, he was discharged and he went back home to Yuba City to move in with his parents. Initially, when he came home, he really struggled. They hadn't found a good way to manage his diagnosis. But, eventually, his doctor found the right mixture of medications and treatment, and he totally stabilized him. In fact, was able to even hold down a job working part-time with his stepfather in his gardening business. Now, what really brought this group of 5 men together was their shared love of sports, really basketball specifically. When they got together, they were either talking about basketball, watching basketball, or playing basketball. The gateway program that they were all enrolled in, the vocational rehab program, they had a basketball team. And so, they all played on that basketball team and they were super passionate about that team. In February of 1978, their basketball team, along with a host of others, were slated to compete in a tournament where the winners of this tournament would get a free trip out to Los Angeles. And so, the Yuba City 5 was so excited about this tournament. Their tournament was supposed to start on February 25th, 1978. But Their favorite basketball team, UC Davis, was playing just 50 miles away from them in Chico, California on February 24th, the night before their big tournament. So, they decide that they want to go watch this game, right? They want to go out to Chico and root on their favorite team, but make sure they're back in time so they can get a good night's sleep before their tournament starts on the 25th. So, they load up in Madrugas, Montego, they drive the 50 miles out to Chico, California, and they root on their team, UC Davis, who ends up winning the game. Now, there were multiple witnesses that saw the Yuba City Five at this basketball game, so we know they were there. Following the game, the boys loaded up into Madrugas, Montego, and they drove a short distance to a little convenience store in Chico where they got sodas and cartons of milk and some snacks. And the shop owner would actually say to investigators that he remembers them because they came in at about 10 p. And it was when he wanted to close down the shop. And so, he remembers feeling annoyed when this big group, 5 men, coming in there buying a bunch of stuff, cause it delayed the shop owner's ability to close down the store. That sighting at the convenience store would prove to be the last time anyone would see the boys alive. So that night, some of the boys' parents had stayed awake to wait for their son to come home. And when they didn't, and it was starting to get late, the parents started calling each other to ask if they had seen their son. And no one had. And so, not only was it strange because the boys always told their parents and loved ones where they were going to be, but the idea that they would jeopardize a good night's sleep before this tournament that they had been obsessing about just seemed very, very uncharacteristic. And so, by very early the next morning, all the families called the police and said something is wrong. So, the police officer in charge of the investigation was Lieutenant Lance Ayers. Ayers had gone to high school with Ted Weiher, so he had a personal connection to this investigation and was more motivated than perhaps he would have been otherwise to make sure they are doing everything in their power to find these boys. When the first few hours of the search don't turn anything up, Lieutenant Ayers decides that he's going to greatly expand their search radius. And it was because of this expanded search that just a few days later, they were able to locate Jack Madruga's Montego car. Presumably, after the boys had gotten their snacks and drinks at the convenience store around 10 p. They would have been driving straight back to Yuba City because they had that big basketball tournament the next morning. But the car was found 70 miles away from Yuba City, away from Chico, up in a remote forest on a dirt road. The families of the boys had no idea, they couldn't even speculate, why that car would have driven up that access road into this remote forest. There was no reason they'd be going up there, at least none that the families would have any understanding of. In addition to the strangeness surrounding why it was 70 miles away up in some remote forest, it also didn't make any sense that the boys had abandoned the vehicle. Even though it was covered in snow, there was no indication that it had been stuck in snow. There was a quarter tank of gas, so it didn't run out of gas. There were no keys in the ignition, so when the police had to hot wire it to drive it back, the car ran just fine. So, there were no mechanical issues or engine issues. They literally put it in park in the middle of nowhere and got out and left. They looked inside the vehicle, and all that was in there was some wrappers and cans and cartons from the snacks that they had presumably been eating since they left the convenience store. But no keys. All the doors were shut, one window was down slightly, and some wrappers. That was it. So, the search shifts to now looking exclusively in the area that this car was found. And over the first couple days following the discovery of the car, they're looking everywhere and there's no sign of the boys. And then, unfortunately, a massive snowstorm rolls and basically covers everything to the point where it's impossible to search. And they had to abandon the search until the early spring, when the snow had melted a bit. During this waiting period, the families of the boys put out rewards or requesting information from everyone and anyone that had it. The police were fielding thousands of tips and unconfirmed sightings about where they could be, but none of it amounted to anything. They made no progress. They had no idea where these boys were. On June 4th, 1978, so just a little over 3 months after the boys had gone missing, some motorcyclists that had been on a long road trip happened to be up in those mountains on those dirt roads near where the Montego, the car had been discovered. They were about 20 miles from that point, and they had found this cul-de-sac that they parked their bikes in. And they decided to just kind of stretch their legs. And they look down a little ways off the cul-de-sac and they see this old-looking trailer. And they decide, just out of curiosity, to just kind of walk over and see what it is. It would turn out that it was a trailer maintained by the Forestry Service, but it really hadn't been upkept in a long time. And so, as they're walking over, they see that one of the windows has been broken and they think, okay, it's more than likely abandoned. And they think they're just going to open the door, poke their head in, and just see what's in there, just purely out of curiosity. 'Cause they're kind of in the middle of nowhere and they're just curious. So, they go up and they open the door and they're immediately hit with this horrible smell. And they shut the door and they're like, I don't know what's in there. Smells like death. It would turn out that it was death. It was one of the Yuba City Five. It was Ted Weiher, who was the oldest of the group, who looked after Jack, who was the youngest of the group. It was his body. The mystery really only deepens when you go inside the trailer. Ted Weiher was found wrapped in 8 blankets on this bed inside of this trailer. His feet were badly frostbitten and gangrenous. He looked like he had lost about 50% of his body weight and he had growth on his face, like his beard. That showed he'd been laying there almost certainly for about 13 weeks. Ted had died from a combination of starvation and from exposure to the elements. But in the trailer, in plain sight, were loads of fire-making materials. You had paperback books, you had kindling, you had matches, you had firewood tonin. In addition to the fire-making material, there was additional clothing, heavy clothing like for cold weather. There was lots of food, like sea rations, military sea rations, where you can basically pop it open and you have some food. Enough to feed someone for at least a year. So, there's food in plain sight. There's fire-making supplies in plain sight. And also, there was a propane tank out back that was basically full that, if they just turned it on, they could have turned on the heat inside of the trailer, and then you would have had heat for quite some time. But there were no signs that any of these supplies were ever touched. Now, one could potentially make the case that perhaps Ted, lacked the common sense to make a fire and to use up all the resources that were right in front of him. But Gary Mathias's shoes were inside of that trailer. And Gary was in the army, and I was in the military, and I can tell you that the number one thing you're taught, pretty much no matter where you go in the military, is how to survive. You're taught to be resourceful and to use things in front of you to stay alive. And it just seems very strange that if you had Gary in there that he wouldn't have immediately started a fire, or at least instructed the group to start a fire and eat the food, turn on the gas tank. Those are things that are just basic life-saving skills. A day after Weiher's body is found inside of that trailer, searchers discover Sterling and Madruga's remains, located approximately 11 miles from where the car had been located. Their remains showed signs of significant predation. Animals had gotten to their remains, and so there wasn't much left of them. But from what was left, investigators were able to determine that both had passed away from hypothermia. 2 days after Madruga and Sterling's remains are found, Jack Hoot's remains are found as well, 2 miles from the trailer where Weiher had been found. And Jack Hoot had also died of hypothermia. So, the 5 have been located, leaving Gary Mathias, who to this day has never been found. The only thing that investigators discovered was about a quarter mile away from the trailer where Weiher was found. They found a bunch of blankets and a flashlight. It seems like that could have been where Gary at one point had been, but they don't know for how long and they don't know where he went after that. So, in addition to wondering where Gary went, you gotta ask yourself, why did these 5 men doctor 70 miles out of the way the day before they knew they had this big basketball tournament that they were not about to jeopardize? Why did they doctor 70 miles away onto a remote dirt road in a remote forest? Why did they then suddenly park their car, turn it off, take the keys out, shut the doors, and then hike 20 miles in the dead of night in a snowstorm to some random trailer? And then get in the trailer where there's ample food, there's ample blankets and additional clothes, but use none of it and die over a 13-week period from starvation and exposure. Why? And so, there's many theories as to why this happened, ranging from, Gary Mathias is somehow responsible and that's why we haven't found him yet, They simply took a wrong turn-in. That's how they wound up in this mountain in the middle of nowhere. But none of it really accounts for the purposeful sins of all of their travel. If they had gotten lost, police believe they would have been maybe driving in loops. They wouldn't have just driven in a straight line, reached this point in the road, and then gotten out. It's not consistent with being lost. So, we don't know why they wound up on that road, or why they decided to go to that trailer, or what caused them not to use the supplies. But something happened. Something forced them to do this, and to this day, we don't know what it was. So, I'd love to hear your theories as to why the Yuba City 5 did what they did. Give me your best theory and I'll do my best to go through and respond to as many as I possibly can. If you like this story and you want to hear more like it, I post stories like this 3, 4, 5 times a week. And if that's something you're interested in, I would encourage you to gently karate chop the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can send me a direct message on Instagram where my handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I'm very active on TikTok where my handle is MrBallen, just like my YouTube page. So, wherever I see you, I just appreciate your support. It's really been a blast making these videos, and it just means the world to me that so many people are as interested in these stories as I am. So, thank you all for your support. Thank you for watching to the end of this video, and until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Some call this location the most paranormal location on the planet. Others call this whole thing just a big hoax. But what is undeniably true, and frankly, what makes this case so much more interesting, is that, unlike the vast majority of paranormal stories and claims, this case was put to an enormous amount of scientific scrutiny. In fact, there was a decade-long study done on this case where judges and scientists converged on this one location and basically, around the clock, studied, all these claims of the paranormal that was happening in the area. And after a decade of research, the findings are pretty mind-blowing. And the case that I'm referring to is none other than the very famous Skinwalker Ranch. So, the too long, didn't read version of the story is, you have a family that purchases a ranch out in Utah, and as soon as they move it, they start noticing some pretty bizarre things around their property. Everything from, some of their livestock going missing or being harmed. They have strange sightings in the woods of creatures and lights in the sky. They eventually report it to the news, and that news story gets picked up by a couple of other outlets. And a billionaire who is obsessed with researching the paranormal sees this story. He buys the property and installs an entire team of scientists and researchers to basically try to figure out what was happening at this ranch. And they spend 10 years studying this ranch. The outcome is, turns out some strange things really were happening there. Before we get started, if this type of content appeals to you, the kind of strange, dark, mysterious content delivered in a story format, if that appeals to you, that's what my channel's all about. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, please gently ransack the like button and then turn on all notifications so you can get all of my content every time I upload every week. Alright, on with the story. In the northeastern corner of Utah lies a 500-acre plot of land. It's all desert where a ranch sits, and that is Skinwalker Ranch sits. It was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was actually built on a piece of land that had apparently been cursed prior to its construction. The Navajo tribe had a feud with the Utes Native American tribe. The Utes were selling off other Native Americans that they would capture. They would sell them into slavery, to the United States. And so the Navajo, who had previously lived in the area where this ranch actually was built, they were forced off their land as the Utes came in and were rounding them up and selling them into slavery. And before the Navajo left that area, they cursed the land with what's called the Skinwalker Curse. The idea was they were going to torment the Ute tribe for the hardships they had inflicted on the Navajo. The Skinwalker Curse. Legend has it, is this curse where these witches descend on the area and take the form, or wear the skin, of various predatory animals in the area, namely large wolves and foxes. They inhabit those bodies and terrorize anybody in the cursed land. At some point, this ranch is actually built on the land that had apparently been cursed. It wasn't until many years later when owners of that ranch started seeing predatory animals doing some very strange things in and around their property. They did some research on the area, learning about this curse, and then before long, the nickname, it stuck. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman purchased Skinwalker Ranch. It had actually been abandoned by the previous owners for the last few years, so when they purchased it, they got it for way below market price. So, they are just so excited to be moving in. They breed cattle. And so they had, 500 acres to let their cattle free roam. It was like the dream purchase for this family. And so when they finally do move in, like the day they move in, they don't really care that, the grass is overgrown. It looks like things are kind of in disrepair. And in fact, when they go into the homestead, like the actual house on the property, they were so excited about everything that they kind of overlooked some of the strange things that they immediately noticed about the property. And they go inside and every window has a deadbolt on it. The inside and outside of every door in the house, not just the doors leading outside, doors leading between rooms had locks, the front and back side. They noticed these big spikes that were driven into the ground at the front door and back door of the property with massive chains stringing off of them, which looked like, pretty powerful guard dogs had been there. They're thinking to themselves, well, this is a huge piece of property. Perhaps the previous owners were a little bit paranoid, cause they're kind of isolated. And so they didn't really raise a red flag when, to be honest, had I moved into a property where every single door and window had multiple locks on it, they have these big guard dogs, I'd probably ask a couple questions. But, you know what? Terry and Gwen are just so excited about this purchase that, again, they kind of just overlook it. So on the day that they are moving in, Terry and Gwen have some family members over to help them offload trucks and move stuff into the homestead. And it's during this process as they're moving things out of the truck into the house and again, you gotta remember that the house is situated like right in the middle of the property. And you can see in like every direction basically unobstructed because it's basically open desert with the exception of a couple areas that are, basically forests. And as they're offloading some of the stuff into the house, Terry looks out at one of these tree lines and he notices this huge wolf, or what looks like a wolf, pretty well off in the distance, kind of meandering its way over towards them. But it's far enough off that this is not enough to be totally worried about it. After all, Terry was a rancher and his family were fairly rugged. They carried weapons and they were used to, protecting their livestock from predators. So, this was not a, oh my goodness, I can't believe a wolf is near us. It was more like, okay, let's make a note that there's a wolf walking towards us. And so Terry does. He tells his family, hey guys, just so you know, there's a wolf coming towards us right now. And the whole family is now standing near the truck and they're watching this wolf. And Terry recalled as he's staring out, watching this wolf that's kind of almost walking him like a snake-like serpentine. Half towards them from hundreds of yards out, it's still quite a ways out. Terry notices that there was a fence that was out where this wolf is wolf. And the fence was pretty big and the spaces between posts were about 6 feet. When he had a good look at the wolf next to the fence, he could tell that the wolf was at least 6 feet long. And he was thinking, are my eyes playing a trick on me? Like, that's an enormous wolf. That's the biggest wolf I've ever seen. But the wolf wasn't acting angry or aggressive. It was just kind of skulking its way towards them, very nonchalant, broad daylight. And at some point, Terry and the family, they're standing behind the truck. And Terry said that they all had this feeling that the wolf was not going to harm them. And the wolf got about 100 yards away, and Terry and his family are transfixed. And he even said he didn't understand why they weren't scared, or why they weren't, running away or shooting at it, or something. But they didn't. All of them are just standing there watching this wolf that's massive. And the wolf is wagging its tail and acting like a domesticated dog. the wolf comes over and goes up near Terry's father, who was there helping unload some of the gear they had. And Terry's father just kind of reflexively reaches out to start petting this. He's petting like up at his head level, this massive wolf. And the wolf just acts like a domesticated dog and kind of rubs against his hand and then starts walking away from them, just wagging its tail end. And not doing anything, not causing them any harm, not snarling, not growling, nothing. But just as nonchalantly as it walked over to them, it walks over to where they had a pen with a couple of cows and calves inside of this pen, and one of the calves had its head through the post that was keeping them in this cage, just kind of watching this wolf. And the wolf notices it and, in an instant, jumps over to this calf and immediately has the whole head of the calf in its jaws, just trying to rip it out of the cage. But it can't get it to squeeze through the cage. And so, all of a sudden, Terry and his family are broken out of this weird trance and Terry starts firing shots at the wolf. It strikes the wolf and has no impact. They run over, they start hitting it with the back end of an axe. They're trying to get this thing off of the calf because their livestock, that was their livelihood. And these are rugged people, so they're trying to fight to save their property, to save their cows. And the wolf is just totally unaffected. It's not trying to attack Terry or his son that are trying to get rid of it. The wolf is just trying to attack the cow, but it won't let go. And finally, it just kind of gives up on the calf, starts kind of retreating. Terry ends up getting his rifle, a high-powered rifle, and takes a shot at the wolf one more time. But again, it just has no impact on the wolf. And the wolf just at some point, just as bored, turns around and kind of trots off into the woods. After they kind of were brought out of that initial trance, they remember this horrible smell that's like foul, almost chemical smell, that just permeated the whole area. After the wolf was there, Terry and his son, they decided to go track this wolf because now there's this massive predator that's going to make owning cattle extremely difficult. And so they would have to go deal with this predator. And so instead of retreating into the house, they grabbed their weapons and they tracked the wolf that's now jogged off into the forest. And they make it to an area in the forest where the ground is very muddy and sodden. And Terry could easily make out these footprints that just suddenly stopped. And they just couldn't make sense of it. And so they went back to the house and they told their family, we tracked it into the woods. There's no blood trail. There's nothing. It just walked and unvanished. So, this is day one of being at this ranch, and they're all on edge now. The whole family is on edge. They really don't know what to make of that wolf, the sheer size of it, the fact that it was totally unaffected by being shot multiple times. There's real concern over their own livelihood because they keep cattle and they're only going to have more that are going to be out in these pens. And if there are wolves that are 3 times the size of a normal wolf that are walking around killing cattle, that's a big problem if you own cattle. And so they're on edge, and they're all, in a way, trying almost not to talk about how crazy and how the wolf was. They're just they're treating it like it's just a normal predator problem. Man, we gotta get those wolves. We gotta protect our cattle. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're something very strange is happening here. Gwen, she was having some other very strange things that were happening to her that she was not tying to the wolf thing. She was just noticing a couple of distinct things that were happening to her that made her think that she actually had a very real, medical problem, that she had true memory issues. Because 2 things happened. One, in that first week, she had gone to the grocery store and when she came back, she put the groceries away, and then she left to go to the other room. And when she came back, all the groceries were now back in the bags. So for 20 minutes, she's just sitting there dumbfounded with, did I put the groceries away? Same day, she goes to take a shower and she hangs her towel in the bathroom like anyone would. And she takes a shower and then when she gets out, the towel's missing. And she's She gets another towel and she towels off. And then she finds the towel hanging up in a closet on the other side of the house. And so, between the groceries and the towel, she's like, is there something wrong with me? Am I like having a stroke? Am I having a medical issue here that I'm like literally losing my mind? And it wasn't until Terry actually had a similar experience that she started to wonder if this had to do with maybe the strangeness with the wolf. That may be the strangeness with the wolf. There's just something odd happening about this property. And it was Terry in that first week. He had been digging holes for a new fence, and he had this big fence digging tool. It was about 70 pounds that he was using to dig the holes for the fence. And so he had taken a break too. After making a bunch of posts for this fence, he took a break, left his fence digging tool, at the last place he had dug a post, and he went in to grab a bite to eat. Came back out and his fence digger is missing. And initially, he just goes into the house and he's like, hey, to his wife, to his kids, like, did you guys move my fence digger? Like, do you know what happened to it? Like, where is it? It's not out there. And they're like, no, we've been in the house the whole time. I have no idea. And so they couldn't find it. And a week goes by and he's out patrolling his property looking for wolves and in the tree, like, well away from where he had been digging the post before. And the tree, his fence digging tool that's 70 pounds is like 70 feet in the air, strung up in this tree. So Terry comes back to the house and he tells his family about the fence digging tool being in the tree. And that's when Gwen tells Terry about her experiences with the groceries going back in the bag and the towel being moved around the house. And everybody in the family starts to really start being scared. We can't explain what's happening on this property, and we're very isolated. And what's the deal with all these locks on all the doors? I mean, they're starting to feel really concerned. Following the fence digging tool being found, Terry started to notice lights on his property. Initially, cause this was the first couple of weeks there, he would see lights way at the far end of his property that looked like headlights. And he would think, someone must have made a wrong turn that wound up on my property, and we were kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and they'll just leave. And so when he first started seeing these lights, that's what he assumed it was, just people making a wrong turn. But he started to see it so often that he wondered if people were illegally hunting on his property. And so one night, he sees these lights on his property and he goes out to investigate. In fact, he's angry. He's had all these strange things happen. His family's on edge, And now, he's mad and he's going to take it out on this person who's illegally hunting on his property. And he starts charging out to these lights, and he starts getting closer and closer, and he starts to realize it's not making any sound. If this was like a truck, it's not making any sound, and we're in an area where I could totally hear that if it was a vehicle. And he can't hear anything. And as he gets closer and closer, the lights start retreating from him without making a sound, and then float up into the sky and disappear. And Terry's like, what is going on here? The winter rolls around and it's a particularly brutal winter. And one night he couldn't account for one of his cows. And so he's out looking for this one stray cow and, he searches his whole property. And there's only one area that he hasn't searched, and it's that forest where the giant wolf had disappeared after marching in there, and they tracked it in there. So he goes in there, and as soon as he gets to the tree line, he notices there's a bunch of footprints from what looks like a cow. And he's relieved because it's probably his. He follows it into the woods, and much like the wolf that had just disappeared in that muddy, sodden area in the forest, in the same spot, the footprints that appeared to be this cow had also just, disappeared. And then, over the course of the remainder of the winter, that would happen for more times. The animals would run away and just disappear without a trace. By the end of the winter, after all these animals have just mysteriously disappeared, Terry and his family, but Terry in particular, has really gone into full paranoia mode. He at night would just stalk his own property, hiding behind bushes with his weapon and hope to see what was taking his cattle. And so one night as he's, doing another fruitless search around his property, he catches out of his periphery what looks like a kind of mass of something moving around in the trees near his property. And at this point, he was kind of obscured by some shrubs and some plants. And so he kind of crouched down and looked out at the tree line, and he sees in the tree line this, like, strange shape kind of moving about inside of the trees. And he would describe the mass as looking almost like a stealth fighter jet, but really small, and it was making no sound. And it was hovering about 20 feet off the ground. And he's crouched down, not making a sound watching it, and it's just kind of like moving around the tree line. And it has these lights that look to be kind of scanning the ground. And it's just kind of moving around. It's shining these lights, these multicolored lights, in the ground. And Terry moves a tiny bit to get a better angle on this thing, and he makes the tiniest of noises against the brush, just like a tiny little, barely audible sound. And this mass that's pretty far away, the lights immediately turn off, and it angles itself so it's facing directly at Terry. And Terry can feel it right away that it's heard this tiny little sound he's made, and now it's staring directly at Terry. And Terry's like terrified. And he's looking at this thing wondering like, oh my God, like, is it gonna come take me? Like, what is this? Is this the thing that's been taking my livestock? And he's terrified and he's staring at it, and it just flies away. By the spring of 1995, things have gotten really, really bad for Terry and his family. Now, not only are they losing livestock inexplicably, but they're showing up. The actual cows themselves are showing up back on their property, hours or days later, just kind of in random locations on the property. And they look like they've had surgery done, like precision cuts, and pieces of them are missing. And in addition, some very strange things are happening at the house. At night they would see these entities walking around their property. These humanoid, they described them as having no expression, just walking around their property. And sometimes they would walk right up to the glass, put their hands on the glass and look in, but there was no face. And like Terry and his family, they had blinds down. And they would use the deadbolts on every single door and window. But they could hear them rapping at the glass, and they could hear them communicating in a language they didn't understand right outside of their house. And this became so regular that it was almost impossible to sleep. Terry's kids started performing very poorly in school because they weren't sleeping. Terry's wife, Gwen, she lost her job at the bank because she wasn't sleeping, and she was like delusional. They were all just at an absolute breaking point. Terry is now feeling totally disheartened. One night he's sitting on his porch with his rifle and, he notices out on the horizon a new phenomenon. He was used to seeing the lights on his property that would be off in the distance that would disappear, and, he had previously seen that kind of, like, fighter jet thing that was scanning the area. Like, those were the types of lights he would see. But there was a new light he saw as he's sitting on his porch. It was almost like this orangey orb that appeared off in the distance. Since he had his rifle with a high-powered scope on it, he just lifts up his rifle and he looks through his high-powered scope and he zooms in all the way. And he can see that this orb, he describes it as a portal, that as he's looking at it, it has almost like an oval shape to it. And even though it was nighttime, in the middle of the orange orb is this blue sky. It's as if he's looking through a portal into another world where it's broad daylight and there's a sky. And he doesn't know what to make of it, but he can see that a black figure is crawling out of this portal into his property. And it looks just like the black entities that were put, basically walking around his property at night. In addition to these figures that are crawling like, imagine that scene from The Ring where the girl crawls out of the well, that they're crawling out of this portal into his property and then scurrying away into the tree line. And he sees weird craft as well coming into his property through this portal, and then the portal shuts and disappears. Following this night with the orange portal, Terry started to notice blue orbs that he and his family would say were the worst and most terrifying thing of all of the things they experienced, and considering they had tall, featureless black humanoids appearing in their windows and rapping on their windows that's saying something. Okay, so a blue orb started showing up on their property. And the way they described it, Terry and his family, was whenever the orb came near you, it gave you this extreme sense of anxiety. It was almost like it was emitting this feeling that you automatically got, where suddenly you were unbelievably anxious and terrified of the blue orb. And then as soon as it left, you would, not be anxious anymore. And so, one night, he's sitting on his porch like he had begun doing, and he sees this orb show up on his property. And his 3 dogs are sitting with him that see the orb, and they start growling and barking. And so, he lets his dogs go, thinking that maybe they can scare this thing off. And the dogs take off running towards this blue orb and they chase it. And you can see the orb, Terry can see the orb that starts to kind of retreat. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, I finally won something. My attack dogs are gonna scare this orb away. And they chase off into the woods, and he sees this thing, the blue orb, retreat into the woods. And then, when he's thinking again that finally a little victory for us, he hears his dogs yelping, and he's too terrified to go check it out. And so he ends up going inside and locking the doors, locking the windows like they had been, and just kind of retreating. So the next day, when the dogs haven't returned, Terry and his son, they go out looking for the dogs in the forest. When they get out there, they get to a clearing and they find 3 stacks of ashes in like little burned out circles, as if there had been a fire previously in these 3 little spots. And it turned out it was the ashes of his 3 dogs that had gone into the woods. They had just been vaporized. Terry decides that it's time to leave, and he wants to sell the ranch. And so he puts the property up for sale and goes to a local news outlet, and he tells them about what's happening on his property. And as fate would have it, a billionaire by the name of Robert Bigelow, who had invested millions of dollars in standing up this scientific research team, this all-star team of judges, specifically to research what he described as high strangeness, which really is just paranormal. Basically, he was obsessed with the paranormal and wanted to investigate the paranormal. And he had actually seen that fairly obscure story. When he saw that it was up for sale, Robert Bigelow, the billionaire, saw this great opportunity to buy the piece of property and actually make it the headquarters of his own scientific research team. Not only to investigate what was happening on Skinwalker Ranch, but use it as kind of a hub to do other scientific research. So he purchases the ranch, and Terry actually, even though he did not want to spend any time at the ranch, on some level wanted to know what the research was going to show because he was very curious, like, what is going on at this ranch that's been plaguing my family? So he offers to stay on as kind of like the ranch manager because, Robert Bigelow and his team are a bunch of scientists and business people. They don't have any experience on the ranch, and so they're happy to keep him. So Terry is still connected to the ranch, but at this point, he sold it to Robert Bigelow. So Robert Bigelow's scientific team was called the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, and IDS, NIDS for short. And Bigelow had actually built the team before purchasing Skinwalker Ranch team. And what he went out and did is he recruited some of the most incredible scientists and judges he could possibly recruit. But he didn't want people that were interested in the paranormal. He wanted people that were inherently skeptical, so that if he was ever able to kind of prove the existence of high strangeness, that he would have credibility in doing that. And so he went out and found these incredibly skeptical, incredibly smart scientists and judges. And so they move into Skinwalker Ranch, and the first thing they do is they need to start doing testing to make sure that this whole all the stories about Skinwalker Ranch coming from Terry and his family were not just some grand delusion by the family that, they could have just made it up. And so they get in there and they start running these tests. So that first year, as they're running these tests, which are largely things like, okay, let's check the environment and see if there aren't any, plants that are giving off spores that could be hallucinogenic that they're breathing in. Let's check their water supply and make sure there wasn't something happening in their water supply. Let's do psychological assessments of the family. Let's ask neighbors. Let's do all of our diligence to make sure it's not something environmental or psychological. And over that first year, while they're doing this research, there isn't much activity at the ranch. save a couple of instances where there were some strange lights. So that first year is fairly uneventful. But what's important is that the NIDS researchers come to a conclusion that this did not seem like a hallucination. This did not seem like something coming from, a plant or water supply. This seemed like Terry and his family were really experiencing something odd. They just didn't know what it was as. One day, Terry and actually Gwen, who was helping him, were tagging some of the new calves. The new cows that had been born, putting these little tags in their ears. And, so Gwen was there helping. And so Terry and Gwen, they tagged this new calf, put a yellow tag in its ear, and they move on and they're tagging other animals. And so for about 40 minutes, their eyes and their attention are not focused on this one calf or that one area of the ranch. They're tagging other animals. And then their dog that was with them, starts scrolling unreacting in the direction of where this calf had been. And so Terry and Gwen turn around and they look, and they don't see anything, and they start walking over. They find the calf that they had tagged about 40 minutes ago has been basically surgically dissected and all that's left are its legs and its head. And in addition, the ear where that tag had been removed. And so they immediately call over the NIDS researchers. So the NIDS veterinarian comes over and looks at the scene and just can't make sense of it because the incisions on the calf were so well done that it looked like someone with real surgical expertise had done this on an operating table. There was no sign that this was done by a predator, and there was no blood anywhere. So this prompts a massive search of the property because, in many ways, this is what the NIDS researchers are looking for. Real occurrences of something that is highly strange that they can go investigate. And so all of the researchers and everybody there begin searching the property for whoever was responsible for this, dissection of the cow. And they start searching the property. And the dogs, they had all these guard dogs that were kept at each of these observation posts that they had set up around the ranch. As soon as the NIDS team had moved in, they were all looking in the same direction. All four of these 4 observation posts. And they're all cowering in the back of their cages, all looking in the same direction. And so they start making their way towards the tree line where all these dogs are looking, and they stop short when Ari says, "I see something in the tree." So they stop their car and they're looking, and in the tree is this massive wolf, this wolf-like humanoid that's basically perched on a tree limb. And Terry takes out his rifle and he aims at the creature up in the tree, this huge creature, and everybody sees it. All the NIDS researchers are looking at this creature and they're like, "Oh my god, what is that?" Terry starts firing at this thing, and it just disappears into the woods. And so the team charges into the woods, they fan out, and they pick up a couple of tracks of this huge thing that has this massive footprint with these huge claws. But much like the wolf that had disappeared and the cattle that had suddenly disappeared when they went into the woods, they couldn't find any traces of this thing. But they did smell this horrible stench that, Terry remembered smelling. It stuck with him that first day when that large wolf had come over. On the very first day they were moving in, it was that same smell, but they couldn't find this huge animal. So, dumbfounded, the NIDS researchers just go back to the property and no one can make sense of it. And they have the footprint and they have their own eyewitness testimony, but, they couldn't make sense of how something that big could just get away. And so over the following month, they're searching the property and they're looking for any more signs of this huge creature or anything. The only thing they noticed is that the guard dogs consistently stayed in their kennels and did not want to come out. They were acting like they were kind of being hunted, and they were very they were cowering quite a bit, and they were scared to go out in the open, but they couldn't find anything. So it was around this time that Terry and Gwen are kind of back to doing work around the ranch. And one day they're driving off to one section of the ranch and they pass by the corral where 4 of their prized bulls were. These are very expensive animals that are all in this enclosure. And so they doctor past and they take a mental note that they're seeing these bulls in this enclosure. And they drive off to the other side of the ranch where they're doing some work, tagging animals and, building fences. Whatever it is they were doing. But when they come back and they round the corner they're first able to see the corral of bulls again. They are like, where they are they? 'Cause the bulls were not in their enclosure and they weren't anywhere. And so they are panicked because these are very expensive animals. And they run over, and Terry sees that the gates to the corral are still locked, but there's no bulls in there. There's no sign of a struggle or anything. And it just so happens that right next to the corral was this fairly small trailer, that hadn't been used in years. In fact, it was literally wired shut. It was just sitting there. And Terry, just for whatever reason, runs over and looks in one of the windows. And inside of this tiny enclosure are these 4 bulls, completely calm, all crammed into this tiny trailer. They could barely fit. They're not fighting with each other or anything. They're just calmly sitting there as if they're in some kind of a trance. And Terry yells to Gwen like, hey, they're over here. They're right here, right? And it, startles the bulls out of their trance. They start panicking and kicking, and they end up getting them out of this enclosure. And it takes them hours to finally round them up and get them back in the corral. But, they're unharmed. But it is almost impossible to get even one bull into that small of an enclosure. It would take hours to maybe be successful at doing that. To get 4 bulls into that enclosure was pretty much impossible. And to do it when they basically were calm after they were in there is also somewhat impossible. And it was important to note that Terry saw when he looked in the window that the only entrance to that trailer was wired shut still. It had not been undone. In fact, the cobwebs at the corner where the opening basically formed with the sides of the trailer, they were still intact. Like it had not opened. And it made no sense how those bulls got in there. And so the NIDS researchers come over and they can't make sense of it either. Upon further investigation, the NIDS researchers found that the bars of the corral that held the bulls, a section of it, had been highly magnetized. And so while they're doing this research, trying to figure out if magnetic fields has anything to do with the strange occurrences at the ranch, 2 of the NIDS researchers were on the outskirts of the property, using their compass to look for magnetic fields. And they started smelling. They both reported smelling that horrible metallic, like rotting smell that other people had reported smelling anytime they saw that large wolf creature. And when they started smelling it, their compass started to flitter and then pointed away from north towards wherever the smell was. And they remember thinking that they felt like they were being watched. And it went on for a few moments, and their compass didn't waver. It was aimed in the direction of the smell. And they're both on opposite sides, pointing in the same direction. And then at some point, the smell stops and they stop feeling anxious. And the north arrows go back to the way they should have been condensed. And then one of the most terrifying of all of the paranormal occurrences that happened at Skinwalker Ranch happened at the very end of 1997. 2 NIDS researchers were up on a ridgeline overlooking the homestead. Every night it became commonplace to basically position NIDS researchers all over the property to basically be on the lookout for weird things that are happening. And these 2 researchers are up on this ridge, kind of obscured and hidden, and they see this orange orb take shape right near the homestead. And one of them had an infrared goggles, so he looks down at the orb, and he can clearly make out that it's this oval-shaped opening. That sounded an awful lot like what Terry had seen on his porch when he saw that humanoid creature crawling out of the portal into his property. Well, these 2 researchers are looking at this portal and they see the same thing. This black human-like creature crawling out of this orange portal onto the ground, and then it starts running up the hill towards them. And they're frozen with fear. They start smelling that horrible rotting metallic smell as this big human-like creature bounds up the mountain. And they can hear the shale under its feet as it runs up. And it goes right past them, about 30 feet away from them. They're looking at it, and it just barrels past them at a full sprint up into the mountainside. The following year, in 1998, the activity on the ranch declined significantly. All they had was the occasional strange lights here and there, but for the most part, it was done. And in fact, even though NIDS remained on the property, by 2004. The research just wasn't amounting to anything, so they pulled the plug on the operation. They did have footage of a number of the lights that were seen, but again, no one's gonna take a picture of some random lights and say, "Oh, there you go, proof." You know, they demonstrated that there were, magnetic fields, and they have images of these calves that would reappear after looking like they had surgery done to them. They had hundreds of eyewitness reports. They have all this information, but none of it was really definitive proof, which was very frustrating to Robert Bigelow, to Terry and his family. And the way they described it is they felt like they were dealing with an entity, or a group of entities, that were just consistently one step ahead of them. That they could catch glimpses of what they were doing, but it was never enough to really understand what was happening. They never felt like they were in control. It was always clear that this entity or these entities were in control of the situation, and they never were in a good position to really record hard data or get good footage. Not to mention, this is 1998, this is the late 90s, no one just had an iPhone they can pull out and snap pictures. You had real cameras. And so the best they could do was some pictures of light and some of the animals that had been mutilated. There's been numerous books put together by some of the people that were a part of this NIDS research team. And to this day, they believe that what they saw was a result of some paranormal activity. And to this day, many people believe that this is one of the most credible instances of paranormal activity occurring. So, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, whether you think this is a total fact or a total hoax. Or somewhere in the middle. I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I post quite a bit on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen. And that's gonna do it, guys. I hope you got something out of this, and until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya. Every year, dozens of people, hikers, hunters, backpackers, will go off into the wilds of North America and then come out again claiming to have seen Bigfoot, the 8 to 10 feet tall, intelligent, biped-eyed, hairy creature that kind of is a cross between man and beast. And there's literally been thousands of sightings of that particular creature all over North America. And despite the thousands of sightings, there's never been a substantiated claim. So, Bigfoot has become an urban legend. But no matter how you feel about Bigfoot, whether it exists or it doesn't, if you read through some of the first-hand accounts of these people who claim to have seen Bigfoot in North America, some of them are horrifying. And one account that stands out to me as being the most terrifying comes out of Oregon. There's a couple hotspots all over North America where some of the most sightings of Bigfoot occur, and one of them is in Oregon. In particular, it's the northwestern section of Oregon. And that's where today's story is going to come out of, and it is Jeff Boiler's story. Jeff was a Marine. He was then a police officer, then he became a deputy sheriff, and then he ultimately became a lawyer. What really stands out to me about Jeff's story is that he strikes me as a credible, skeptical guy who, when interviewed, cause he's been on a TV show called Paranormal Witness on the Sci-Fi Channel, he did a follow-on interview. You can Google him. Jeff Boiler's Bigfoot sighting. The way he tells the story, it's like he's not trying to dress it up. He's not trying to make it more dramatic than it really was. It's like he's just telling you what happened to him, and he's not trying to create a theory as to what it was, but rather, just here it is. Here's what happened as I remember it. And it allows you to listen to the story and really relate to it. And it makes it that much more eerie as you listen to what happened to him. And so today, I'm going to be telling Jeff's story. But before I get into that, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format with lots of distracting hand gestures, then you have come to the right place because that is all I do. And I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that's something you'd be into, I would ask you to please gently disembowel the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly upload. Alright, let's get into the story. Back in 1997, Jeff Boiler was a fit, single guy that had been in the Marine Corps for a little while. and then he'd been a police officer. And now he was looking to do something new with his life. And he had always been a huge fan of nature. He loved hiking and hunting. And so he just kind of up and decided to move to Oregon to just be back in nature. And so he goes out to Oregon. He doesn't really know what he's going to do for a job. One of Jeff's friends, who is the elected sheriff of a very rural county in northwestern Oregon, reached out to Jeff and said, "Hey, with your background, you were in the Marine Corps. You were a police officer. Would you want about deputy sheriffs out here in northwestern Oregon?" And Jeff's like, "Wow, great," and took the job. So after being on the job for a couple of months, Jeff is really happy. He loves his job. And he gets off one day from work pretty early, and he steps outside, and he would recall that it was like one of the most beautiful days he had seen in recent memory. It was just this gorgeous day. And even though initially he was planning to just go home, he was like, "You know what? I'm gonna go on a hike." He wanted to go to this fairly hard to access section of the woods that was a little ways up the mountain where, 20 years earlier, he had actually buried one of his very close friends. And so he thought, "You know what? Today, I'm gonna make that trip up to his grave. I'm gonna pay my respects. That's a good way to spend such a beautiful day." So he hopped in his Jeep and he started driving over to the woods that would take him up to this gravesite. It was an unmarked trail, but he had a mapped trail. He knew where it was, so he headed over. Now, Jeff was highly competent in the wilderness, but it needs to be said that he was basically going to be hiking into a section of the Cascade Mountains that was unmarked. This is a very isolated, unmarked area. And in fact, Jeff would even say that sometimes when you would walk around this section of the Cascade Mountains, you would wonder to yourself, has anyone ever been here before? Like, this is such a wild and open expanse. Am I the first person to ever step foot here? It's a section of Oregon that is totally just wild. So Jeff arrives at the dirt lot that's right on the edge of this forest that goes up the side of this mountain. And before he steps in and starts making his way up, he gets his map out and he kind of roughly charts a course because, again, there's no trail in here. He puts his map away and he begins walking up this mountain. He's been walking for about 2 hours and the terrain's really bad. And he decides, you know what? Why don't I deviate from the course that I was on and try to get to a more open area that might be able to kind of bank around to? Get up to the gravesite. He looked on the map and he could see that parallel to where he was going up this mountain, there seemed to be a strip of clearing where it might be easier going. It would require a bit of work to get over to it, but once he was there, he believed he could get up to the gravesite. So before he makes that movement over to the clearing, there was a stream running right next to him, freshwater stream. And so he just bends down, he splashes some water on his face, he gets a drink. And before he actually starts moving towards this clearing, because now he's deviating from the path that he intended to take. And this is an unmarked trail, so he knew that he would need to be really certain where he was going. He didn't have a GPS, This is 1997. He just had his map and compass. So he pulls out his map one more time. He looks at where he needs to go. He closes it up. And so he pulls out his compass and he takes what's called an azimuth, which basically is a way to make sure you're going in the right direction. And so he pulls the compass up to his eye, and as he's looking, he sees just to the right of his viewpoint, about 20 feet above him, there is a tree and a boulder. And behind that tree, someone is watching him. And so he lowers his compass and he just kind of glances over, and he can tell that it's clearly a figure. It's got eyes in its head and it's looking at him. And he's not immediately scared. He thinks that this is a person who's kind of poking their head around a tree at him. And it's daylight. He knows he's out in the middle of nowhere. But he's looking up at it and he involuntarily cocks his head like, hark, ha. And this thing cocks its head. It's mimicking me. It steps out from behind the tree, and it's this huge, human-looking figure that looks very hairy. It's like 8 foot tall. And Jeff's looking up at it like, that's not a human. And so, Not really sure what it is, he instinctively reaches for his sidearm, but he can't get it out of its holster. And he's like fumbling with it, and he's keeping his eyes on this thing that's, maybe 50 feet away from him, 20 feet up on this rocky outcropping. He can't get it out, and the figure's just looking down at him, and it's still got its head cocked to the side. He finally looks down to free his pistol. He draws the pistol, but the creature's gone. And he's like, I gotta get a better look. There was a tree that was pretty high that had a bunch of low branches that he could climb up that would. If he climbed up maybe 15 or 20 feet, he could probably look over into this rocky outcropping. So he starts climbing up this tree, and he looks and he's now level with that rocky outcropping. And he's looking out, and it stretches off quite a way. It's just a whole stretch of forest right there. And he's looking and he can't see or hear anything. And he's starting to wonder to himself, like, did I really just see that? Is my mind playing tricks on me? Am I hallucinating? And so he decides, you know what? I'm gonna climb back down, and I'm gonna go up onto that rocky outcropping. Wasn't planning to, but now I'm going to. And I want to see if I can see some tracks or just see where this thing went. He's a Marine. He was a police officer. He was very comfortable in the wild. He just didn't really scare that easily. And so, he's just kind of curious and he's armed. So he climbs down the tree and he starts climbing up this little rocky outcropping, and he gets up to where this creature was hiding. There's nothing there. There's no scent, there's no anything, and he just decides, you know what? I'm just gonna walk in the general direction that I think this thing went. Because where he was, which was this rocky outcropping, it kind of dead-ended because it's a cliff. So he could pretty much only go inland and up this mountain. And so, he just starts walking. And as he's walking, he's looking for, signs that he could potentially attribute to this creature. He's listening really intently, but there's nothing. After about an hour, he's looking at the map and he's looking around at the terrain, and he's like, I think I'm lost. Like I need to turn around now. And then it dawns on him that he's also lost track of time. It's starting to get pretty dark out, and he does not have a flashlight. So he starts to panic a little bit, because he realizes that his curiosity has now put him in a very dangerous situation. He doesn't have supplies to stay the night. He doesn't have a flashlight. It's getting late, and he's potentially lost. So he tries to compose himself and he just says, okay, I'm just gonna turn around and walk back. Cause he hasn't seen any indication of this creature or this person or whatever it is. So he turns around and he starts backtracking as best as he can. And as soon as he starts moving back from behind him, he hears what sounds like a very large tree break and smash into the ground. And he described it as being louder than most guns. Like, it's an extremely loud sound. And he turns around and he looks, and there's nothing there. But he just figured, that's crazy. Like, I'm lucky that no trio landed on me. He's not thinking that could be, Bigfoot. He's thinking that a tree just fell and I'm lucky it didn't land on me. And so now, even though he is not connecting the falling tree with this creature or person he saw, he's in a bit of a panic state. And so he can't help but associate the experiences. And so he finds himself, as he's walking now a little bit faster and faster away from where he just was, looking over his shoulder in the direction of where the tree fell and where he believed this creature or person was. And as he's walking, looking ahead where he needs to go, but then peering over his head, over his shoulder, over and over again, he hears another loud snap and fall. And it stops him dead in his tracks. It was ahead of him, off to the right, basically on the exact opposite side of where he had come from. And he's thinking to himself, in all the time that I've spent in the woods, it's so rare to be around a tree, suddenly falling unless it's being caused by another tree falling or some other event. It's rare that you would hear two large trees break and fall independent from one another in the same small area but not connected. That's pretty rare. And he's thinking to himself, if that creature or person had anything to do with it, how did it go from over there to all the way over there without me hearing it? It's moving around without me being able to spot it. And so the hair on the back of his neck ends up and he's starting to feel very uncomfortable. He's being hunted. And so he keeps on walking the path, but begins to veer off away from the second snap that he heard. He figures, I'm just gonna split the difference and kind of go a little bit to the left and avoid that falling tree. Still keep my distance from this falling tree and just get down the mountain as quickly as I can. And so, as he starts moving in this kind of slightly new direction, he hears a third falling tree, and now it's back on his left side, closer to that first one he heard, except it's closer to one he heard. He turned around and he couldn't see the result of a large tree falling. He certainly heard it, but he's looking and he can't see anything. And he's thinking to himself, like 3 falling trees? That is not innocent. Something is knocking over these trees. And I think it's that creature I saw. And even worse, as he's thinking to himself, is this creature using these trees to signal to other creatures where he is? Is he being tracked? It's getting closer to him without giving away its own position. He really believed he was being hunted. And so he starts sprinting down the mountain. And as he's running, he's hearing snap, fall, snap, fall, snap, fall. These massive trees are being knocked down on his left and his right side, like you have 2 hunters basically following him. Or it's the same one that apparently can move around in the wilderness without being spotted. And he is absolutely terrified. He's running down the mountain. He's falling, he's getting smashed up every time he falls. And he finally, after about 30 minutes of just running straight downhill with these crashes getting closer and closer to him, he reaches this clearing and he stops abruptly. Cause there's an animal in the middle of the clearing and it's a deer. And the deer doesn't seem fazed by Jeff. The deer sees Jeff, looks behind Jeff, just off to his side, and it tilts its head back and then turns and sprints away. It wasn't running from Jeff. It was running from whatever was right behind Jeff. And Jeff stops, and he starts turning his head in the direction of where the deer was looking, and he can't see anything. And as he's looking, another tree slams, smashing down right behind where he was lands. He takes off sprinting. He knows he's maybe a half mile from his car at this point. And now, as he's sprinting through this field, all he hears is just a cascade of these crashing trees as he sprints the final stretch to his car. Pulls out his key and he starts clicking the automatic locks, and he can't tell if it's working. And he's panicking that it's not going to work in time, and he's going to get to his car and it's going to be locked. He's fumbling with his keys to open the door, and now that the crashing has all stopped and he's just waiting for this thing to jump out and grab him, he manages to open his car, jumps inside, slams it, starts it up, and peels out of there. And then he went back to his office where the sheriff was, and he told him what happened. And he felt ridiculous telling him. And the sheriff was like, I get reports like this all the time. This side of the Cascade Mountains, in that very remote section that you were in, we get reports like that all the time. I believe you. If you want to file a report, go for it, but chances are good it's never going to be followed up with. This is just a phenomenon of being out here in the wilderness. Some people believe it, some people don't. Decades would go by and he would finally share his story, which is why we're hearing about it now. But when he tells that story, if you watch it on Paranormal Witness, you're listening to it like it happened yesterday. This has stuck with this man. And it's clear it had a profound impact on his life. So, while there's never been any substantiated claims of Bigfoot actually existing, some of these reports are eerily similar to one another. And some of the people detailing these sightings are people like Jeff, who really has no reason to lie or embellish. He doesn't really stand to gain much. In fact, he stands to lose, because he could be labeled as kind of like a kook for believing that Bigfoot chased him. So the way I like to look at stuff like this is just to keep an open mind. We don't know half the stuff that's in our ocean, you know. We barely know anything in the universe. What's to say that there isn't some creature like Bigfoot that's managed to evade, you know? Legitimate proof that it exists. I think it's certainly possible. It doesn't mean that I fundamentally believe it's true. It just means that I retain an open mind. But I want to know what you think chased Jeff through the woods. Was it Bigfoot? Was it something else? Or was this just some hoax? And if it was a hoax, are all the other sightings hoaxes too? And if you haven't already, if you enjoyed the story, If you would please gently disembowel the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my 3-2 for weekly uploads of stories that are like this, strange, dark, and mysterious. So, thank you all very much for tuning in. I look forward to reading your comments. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Or you can check me out on TikTok, where I'm quite active. My handle is MrBallen, and I go live on TikTok at 10 p.m. Eastern, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. So I hope to see you there or on Instagram or right here on YouTube. Thank you all for checking out my channel and for watching my video and for sticking it out till the very end. Until next time, see you.